The sound of the slap rang out across the gilded ballroom of a seaside mansion, sharp and merciless, echoing off the marble walls and the crystal chandeliers that hung overhead like fallen stars. And in that instant, more than 50 of the city's most powerful guests, men and women who'd signed million-dollar deals without so much as blinking, sat frozen and utterly silent, not one of them daring to speak. The woman who delivered the blow was Margaret Calloway, 44 years old, the wife of a politician and the owner of a chain of luxury hotels, her dyed blonde hair styled to perfection, her wrists heavy with diamonds, a woman who believed without question that wealth was proof of her own superiority. The one who'd received it was Clara Reeves, 27, a housekeeper in a plain apron, her dark brown hair pulled neatly back, her hands roughened by years of labor, and a pair of gray eyes that were strangely, almost unsettlingly calm. She didn't raise a hand to her cheek. She didn't step back. She simply turned her face slowly back to center and looked Margaret straight in the eye with a composure that sent a chill through the entire room, a feeling none of them could quite name. "People like you should know your place," Margaret pronounced, like a judge delivering a verdict. A thief is always a thief. But what she didn't know, what not a single soul in that glittering room knew, was that the woman she'd just struck and branded a thief was no ordinary maid. For 5 long years, Clara Reeves had been the only person allowed into the most private room of this mansion's owner. The only one who held the keys to chambers even his bodyguards weren't permitted to enter. The only one who'd ever held in her hands a secret powerful enough to destroy an empire, and who'd chosen silence. And the man who owned that empire, Adriano Salvati, 34, cold and quiet, with a faint scar along his jawline and a gaze that seemed to weigh every soul that passed before him, was at that very moment opening the door of his study at the far end of the hall. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to, because in just a few minutes, Margaret Calloway was about to learn a truth she'd never once considered in her entire life, that the person who truly didn't understand where they stood tonight wasn't the girl in the apron, but her. If you believe a person's dignity isn't measured by the clothes they wear or the work they do, hit that like button so this story can reach more people. Share it with someone who needs reminding that real worth can never be taken away. And don't forget to subscribe so you can join us all the way to the end of this story. 16 hours before that slap rang out, when the sun had not yet managed to climb over the horizon beyond the sea, and the whole mansion still lay submerged in the gray-silver light of early dawn, Clara Reeves had already awakened, as she had always awakened for the past 5 years, before anyone else in this house opened their eyes. She walked through the long, seemingly endless corridors covered with carpets so thick that the sound of her footsteps almost dissolved into the air, and perhaps that was exactly what made people so easily forget her presence, because Clara moved through that house in the manner of someone who had memorized every corner, every seam of light, every tiny crack in the paint that an ordinary eye would never notice, quiet and certain as water slipping through stone. She did not hurry, but she was never late. Every movement she made carried a strange economy. Not one wasted gesture, not one wasted breath, as if she had long understood that a human being's energy was a precious thing that should not be scattered over what was meaningless. When she wiped the thin layer of dust from the grand piano in the large sitting room, she did it with complete attention, as if nothing else in the world existed at that moment except the grain of wood beneath her fingers. And when she adjusted a flower that leaned slightly inside the crystal vase, she stepped back half a pace, tilted her head to observe it, then touched it again. Not because anyone would notice, but because she herself would know if it was not perfect. That was what outsiders rarely understood about Clara, that she did not work in order to be seen. She worked for the work itself, for that quiet and enduring feeling of knowing that something had been done properly, decently, with all she had, even if not a single pair of eyes was there to witness it. The other servants in the mansion sometimes talked animatedly between shifts, telling one another rumors about the master of the house, about the mysterious guests who came and went at midnight, about the luxury cars parked outside the gate with darkened windows no one could see through. But Clara rarely added a word. She listened, nodded, smiled just enough not to be considered cold, then returned to her duties, carrying within herself the habit of keeping things hidden that life had taught her very early, that there were silences worth more than any words, and that a person who knew when to keep her mouth shut was often far safer than one who didn't. There was a stillness radiating from her, a kind of stillness that even those who disliked her had to admit was difficult to touch, like the smooth surface of a lake at daybreak, not because nothing moved beneath its depths, but because she had learned not to let the surface reflect the currents below. When a young maid newly hired at the mansion dropped a silver tray onto the marble floor and stood frozen in fear, her face drained white as she waited for a reprimand, it was Clara who stepped forward, quietly bent down to help pick up the scattered spoons, and said softly, just loud enough for the girl to hear, that everyone had days when their hands trembled, and the important thing was to remember to hold on more firmly next time. Then she rose, lightly brushed her apron, and continued on as if nothing had happened, leaving behind a bewildered girl who watched her go, unable to understand why the quietest woman in the house was the only one who did not make her feel afraid, because Clara knew too well the feeling of judgment sweeping over her before she could even open her mouth, knew too well the chill down her spine when standing in a room and sensing that people had already decided who she was before she had the chance to prove otherwise, and because she had carried that feeling for too long and too deeply, she had sworn to herself that she would never be the one to plant it in someone else. That morning, in the pale, gentle light filtering through the tall windows that reached the ceiling, Clara Reeves moved through her house like a soft shadow, completely unaware that before the moon rose high tonight, the very stillness forged through so many years would be tested in front of 50 people, and that the dignity she had quietly guarded would become the only thing strong enough to keep her standing. When the morning light had grown clear enough to reveal the lines of the house, Clara entered the small room hidden behind the main study, a room that, aside from her, no one else among the mansion's large household staff had a key to open. Inside was a security safe built into the wall, something Adriano Salvati had brought in from a maker in Europe, with a thick steel shell and a row of buttons whose code existed in the memory of only 2 people in the world, and Clara was one of those 2. Whenever the mansion received important guests, according to a procedure the master himself had established many years before, every valuable piece of jewelry the guests left in safekeeping, every bracelet, every pair of earrings, every gemstone worth as much as an ordinary person's entire fortune, had to be carefully inventoried, written into a leather-covered ledger, numbered, then placed inside that safe in its own separate compartment. And the only person entrusted with this responsibility, the only person he trusted to lay hands on those possessions, was not the seasoned head of security, not the chief butler who had served the family for decades, but Clara, the quiet maid in her simple apron. She carried out that work with a seriousness that was almost ceremonial, her calloused hands gently lifting each item beneath the light, checking it against the written note, then placing it in its proper compartment, and each time she closed the steel door, she turned the lock twice and tested it once more, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood that trust, once placed in a human being, was the heaviest thing a person could carry, and once she had accepted it, she would not allow herself to be careless for even a moment. The longtime workers in the mansion all knew this clearly, and it had created an invisible distance between Clara and the rest of the staff. Not the distance of jealousy or rejection, but a kind of respect that was difficult to name. The kind of respect people give to someone they do not truly understand, yet instinctively feel can be trusted. The chief butler, an older man who had seen countless people come and go in that house, had once told a colleague that in all his years of service, he had never seen the master hand over the key to anything, to anyone except that girl, and that if Adriano Salvati had chosen to trust a person to such a degree, then that person must carry within her a quality money could not buy, and words could not fake. The younger maids looked at Clara differently, with both curiosity and admiration, often whispering to one another, whenever they saw her step out of the room behind the study, with the leather-covered ledger tucked beneath her arm, wondering what, in the end, she had done, what she had proven, to earn a position even the most senior servants had never been allowed to touch. But none of them dared ask her directly, and Clara never offered the story herself, because to her, the master's trust was not something to boast about or turn into a tale for conversation, but a responsibility she carried in silence, an invisible cord tying her to this house with a bond stronger than any contract or wage. That morning, after she finished checking the safe as usual and made certain that everything remained intact and in its proper place, she locked the room door, slipped the precious key safely back onto its hidden chain, then turned away to prepare for the important evening ahead, never imagining that the silent steel safe itself, the meticulous procedure she had always followed without a single error, would become the center of a storm she had never invited, and that before the night came to an end, the honesty she had preserved for so many years would be thrown into her face by a strange woman as an accusation. The seriousness Clara brought into every gesture, the way she guarded trust as if guarding a fragile treasure, was not something a person learned in school or shaped in a single day, but the only inheritance her mother had left her, a kind of wealth that was not kept inside any steel safe, and that no one could steal. Her father had passed away when she was still too young to hold on to any complete memory of him, leaving only a faint shape in her mind, a voice she was no longer sure was real, or had been drawn up by the imagination of a child growing up without a father. From then on, mother and daughter carried each other through cramped rented rooms, through winters when warmth had to be divided carefully, little by little, through meals where her mother always said she was already full so that Clara could have the larger share. Her mother was a woman who washed clothes and cleaned houses for the better-off families in the area, her hands soaked in water and soap all year until the skin cracked. But Clara had never once seen her bow her head before the people who paid her, never once seen her let poverty bend her back into a timid posture. She entered other people's homes to work with a straight spine and steady eyes, did her work decently and completely, accepted her small wages with a polite thank you, and then left with that same upright bearing. It was that image, repeated over and over through Clara's childhood, that imprinted itself on her heart more deeply than any lesson. Her mother often told her, on evenings when the two of them sat beside the small lamp in their rented room, that people could take many things from you. They could take money, take a roof, take even the chances you deserve to have, but there was one thing no one in this world had the right to touch, unless you handed it over yourself, and that was your dignity, the way you looked at yourself in the mirror each morning and knew you had lived honestly. Clara was too young then to fully understand those words, but she remembered them, tucked them away in a hidden place inside her heart, only to understand many years later just how precious they were. When her mother fell ill, the sickness quietly gnawing at her from within, beginning with bouts of fatigue she tried to hide, then long nights of coughing that would not stop, and finally the days when she no longer had the strength to get out of bed, Clara did everything a daughter could do. She took on more work, labored from dawn until late at night, saved every coin with the fragile hope that if she had enough money, there would be some way, some medicine, some doctor who could keep her mother with her a little longer. But the money she earned was always less than the price life demanded, and she had to stand there watching the only woman in the world who loved her quietly weaken day by day, in a helplessness no words could fully describe. Her mother passed away on a peaceful autumn morning, just as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window, and the last thing she did before closing her eyes was take her daughter's hand, squeeze it very gently, and say with the thin breath she had left that Clara must never let anyone make her believe she was beneath them, because she wasn't. Those words followed Clara through the rest of her life, not like a bleeding wound, but like a small flame carefully kept inside her chest, warm and enduring, lighting her way through her loneliest years. She did not cry much at her mother's funeral, not because she did not hurt, but because she understood that the deepest grief was often the quietest, and that the best way to remember a person who had lived uprightly until her final breath was not to collapse, but to keep standing straight exactly as that person had taught her. And from that autumn morning on, the orphaned girl named Clara carried within herself a dignity that later, no matter how many humiliations life threw at her, no one would ever be able to take away. After her mother died, Clara stepped into life with empty hands and a heart still warmed by the flame her mother had left behind. That year, she had just turned 19, old enough to care for herself, yet still far too unseasoned before the schemes of a world whose cruelty she had not yet fully understood. She found work as a maid in the mansion of one of the wealthiest families in the city, a place where the carpet laid across the entrance alone was worth more than many years of rent for her and her mother combined. A frequent guest of that house, a relative of the owner, was a young, wealthy woman named Margaret, whose cold pride Clara would never forget. It was this woman who later accused Clara of stealing a diamond ring, a woman beautiful in a cold way, always dressed in expensive clothes, looking at the servants the way one might look at pieces of furniture that happened to move, useful when needed and invisible when they were not. Clara worked there with all the devotion her mother had taught her, arriving early, leaving late, never speaking one word of complaint, quietly completing every task she was given, with the severe standard she set for herself. And for a while, she was naive enough to believe that if she worked well enough and honestly enough, people would treat her fairly. She was wrong. One afternoon, the mistress discovered that a diamond ring had vanished from the jewelry box in her private room, and instead of seeking the truth, She needed only to sweep her eyes once across the servants and stop at Clara, the poorest girl there, the newest one, the one with no one behind her and no voice in that house. Then she made the accusation in the firm voice of someone who believed her position gave her the right never to be mistaken. Clara had stood in that splendid room, among the probing eyes of the other servants who quickly lowered their heads to keep from being involved, and she said, in a voice that trembled but did not evade, that she had not taken the ring, that she was willing to let them search anything that belonged to her. But those honest words fell into emptiness like raindrops falling onto stone, leaving no trace behind. The mistress did not even bother to listen until the end. She merely waved her hand to signal the housekeeper, declared that people like Clara did not deserve to be trusted, that she had to leave the house that very night, and that of course she would receive not 1 cent for the month she had worked, because in that woman's words, a thief did not deserve to be paid. That money was everything Clara had been relying on to pay the remaining debt from her mother's final days, the only thin life raft keeping her from sinking all the way to the bottom, and having it torn from her hands so unjustly pushed her into the most miserable month she had ever known. Nights with no place to shelter, long stretches of hunger, moments when she thought the flame her mother had given her might finally be blown out because the winds of life were too cold. But what carved itself most deeply into her heart was not the hunger or the cold, but the feeling of being judged and condemned without even one chance to clear her own name, the feeling of standing before someone who held power and money in her hands, watching that person decide who she was, paste a label onto her that did not belong to her, then brush her hands clean and walk away as if she had only thrown out a piece of trash. In those dark nights, Clara did not allow herself to collapse, though the rage often rose so high it choked her throat, though that injustice was like a blade driven into the deepest place of her self-respect. She quietly swallowed it, did not turn it into hatred, but forged it into a kind of steel, and she promised herself that no matter how many wrongful accusations life might throw in her face, she would never let them make her believe she was beneath anyone. She would never let any person, no matter how rich or powerful, strip from her the one thing her mother had told her to guard at all costs, and she could never have imagined that many years later, the very cold face that had once condemned her would return, seated in the middle of a gilded hall, to perform the exact same cruel drama all over again. It took Clara many struggling years, doing every kind of honest work just to survive, before she slowly found her footing again. And then, on a late winter afternoon, 5 years earlier, fate placed in her hands a test she had no idea would change her entire life. At the time, she was on her way home from an extra shift, her coat pocket nearly empty, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of her jacket, when she saw it lying abandoned on the stone bench of a small roadside park, a luxurious black leather briefcase, the kind of thing only people who belonged to another world would own, forgotten or dropped in the bitter chill of dusk when there was not another soul around. Clara stopped, looked around, then picked it up, and when she opened it to see if there was anything inside that might tell her who its owner was, she found thick stacks of documents, contracts, figures, and names that even at a glance were enough for her to understand that these were matters of great importance, sensitive information about business and money that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could cause damage beyond measure to the person who owned them. In that moment, a thought passed through her mind, not the thought of taking it for herself, but only the fleeting recognition that these papers, to some people, might be worth more than an entire fortune, and that she, a poor girl so desperate she had to count every coin for tomorrow's meal, was holding something many people would pay any price to possess. But that thought only flickered and vanished as quickly as it had come, because immediately, within her heart, she heard her mother's voice, the words her mother had spoken on those nights beside the small lamp, that there were things no one had the right to take from you unless you gave them away yourself, and there were also things you must never take if they did not belong to you, no matter how high the price of honesty might be. Clara found among the documents a business card with a name and a phone number, and instead of doing what desperation might have tempted her to do, she called that number, clearly stated who she was, what she had found and where she had found it, then stood waiting in the cutting cold until a black luxury car glided toward her, and from inside stepped a man she had never met, a man who carried with him a presence that seemed to make the very air around him harden. That was the first time Clara saw Adriano Salvati, and the first look he gave her held not a trace of gratitude or friendliness, but a cold, sharp, searching suspicion. the look of a man so accustomed to betrayal that he no longer knew how to believe in kindness offered for no reason. He took the briefcase from her hand, opened it right there, and slowly, meticulously turned through each page to check whether anything was missing, whether there was any sign that it had been copied or disturbed, and through all that time he did not speak a single word, only occasionally lifted his eyes to look at her as though he wanted to read all the way down to the bottom of her soul and see what she was planning. Clara stood still beneath that gaze, neither shaken nor eager to explain, not trying to make herself seem pitiful in hopes of a reward. She simply waited in silence, standing straight in the manner her mother had passed down to her, and when Adriano finally closed the briefcase, certain that everything was still intact, he looked at her once more, this time for longer, as if he were seeing something he had not expected and could not easily explain. He asked her why she had not kept it, why someone as clearly in need as she was had not taken advantage of this chance, and Clara answered with only one simple sentence, because it was not hers. And the way she said those words, without a hint of hesitation, without a hint of display, made that cold and suspicious man fall silent for the first time in many years, as he looked at a stranger with something very close to respect. A few days after that meeting in the winter cold, a phone call reached Clara, and the person on the other end informed her that Adriano Salvati wanted to invite her to work in his mansion, an offer that at first made her hesitate because she knew too well the feeling of stepping into a wealthy house only to be treated like an object. But in the end, she accepted, partly because of her circumstances, and partly because of some faint instinct telling her that this man was different from the mistress she had known years before, and she was not wrong. In the early days, Adriano still kept the same coldness and suspicion that had settled into his very blood and bone. He observed her from a distance, gave her small tasks, then silently checked whether she did exactly what she had promised, whether she truly was the person that winter afternoon had briefly shown him, because in the world he lived in, trust was the rarest and most expensive luxury, something that, if given wrongly, could cost a person things far more precious than money. But month after month, year after year, Clara proved who she was, not through vows or attempts to win favor, but through the quiet consistency of the smallest acts, through the way she always told the truth even when the truth was inconvenient for her, through the way she never pried into matters that did not belong to her even when they unfolded right before her eyes, through the way she kept every accidental thing she heard or saw inside that house, as though it had been sealed inside a safe, whose key she had swallowed. Adriano was a demanding master to the point of severity. He never praised easily, never showed satisfaction openly, and everyone who worked under him understood that one small mistake was enough to be replaced without mercy. Yet the strange thing was that no matter how cold he was, he never once spoke to Clara in the condescending tone wealthy people so often used with servants, never once looked at her as if she were beneath him. He knocked before entering a room where she was working, called her by name properly instead of merely waving her forward with his hand, and once, when a powerful guest made an indecent remark to her, it was Adriano himself who coldly reminded that guest that in this house, the people who worked for him were treated with respect, no exceptions. Over time, he entrusted her with more and more responsibilities he gave to no one else, from managing the most private areas of the mansion to safeguarding its most valuable possessions, and each time Clara received that trust with the same composed manner, neither proud nor afraid, simply doing her part with all the care she possessed. Between two people who, by all appearances, belonged to two separate worlds, there slowly formed a feeling difficult to name, not family affection, nor anything that crossed the boundary of work, but a deep and durable respect built over the years. From an unspoken understanding that both of them were people, life had once taught painful lessons about betrayal, and both had chosen to answer with honesty instead of deceit. Adriano knew that among all the people surrounding him, from his business associates to his loyal guards, there was not one person he could trust completely the way he trusted the quiet girl in the apron, the one who had once had the chance to destroy him with a single phone call, and had instead chosen to return to him what belonged to him. And that was why, when tonight's important gala was being planned, with more than 50 of the city's most powerful guests gathering under one roof, Adriano did not entrust the coordination of private service to anyone but Clara, placing in her hands the responsibility of making sure everything behind the scenes ran smoothly, never imagining that the very evening he had entrusted to her was about to become the night her honesty would be tested in the cruelest way. When night fell, and the seaside mansion blazed beneath hundreds of crystal lights, Luxury cars glided one after another up to the front steps, and from them emerged people whose names the whole city knew: real estate tycoons, bankers, politicians with carefully rehearsed smiles, all wrapped in the splendor of a world where money was the common language. Among that stream of guests, a glossy black car came to a stop, and the woman who stepped out was Margaret Calloway, 44 years old, her blonde hair styled elaborately down to every strand, wearing an expensive evening gown and jewels at her throat and wrists, so glittering that every step she took seemed to drag a halo of light behind her. She crossed the threshold with the bearing of a woman who believed with complete certainty that every space she entered had to turn around her presence. Her chin lifted slightly, her eyes moving over the crowd not to greet people, but to appraise them, to sort out who in the room was worth the effort of her smile and who was merely the blurred background for her arrival. A young maid stepped forward with a polite smile, reaching out to take the luxurious fur coat from Margaret's shoulders, and Margaret let the coat fall without even bothering to glance at the girl. Without a word of thanks, without a nod, the coat simply leaving her shoulders and dropping into the space where she assumed some pair of hands must be waiting to catch it. To Margaret, the people in service uniforms in that room were not individuals with names and ages, with sorrows and joys, with private lives of their own, but a category, a kind of tool that existed to perform its function and vanish when it was no longer needed. She moved deeper into the great hall, stopped to shake hands with a few guests she considered equal to her level, handed out polished pleasantries honed through years of moving through rooms like this one, and in every gesture there radiated an absolute and unshaken belief that a person's worth was measured by the number in their account, that wealth was not merely a fortunate circumstance but proof, a verdict, a confirmation of something better and nobler already placed within her nature, something those lowly poor could never possess. Margaret Calloway was not cruel in a way that required effort. She did not need to try to be cold. Her contempt for those she considered beneath her flowed out naturally and lazily, like water running downhill, because it had sunk so deeply into her that she did not even realize she was being contemptuous, just as people do not realize they are breathing. In all her life, she had never once suffered consequences for the way she treated people she deemed below her. Never once had anyone powerful enough or brave enough to force her to look at herself, and it was precisely that immunity from consequence, built over so many years, that made her believe the world operated according to the order she had always trusted. An order in which people like her sat high above, while people like the maid, who had just caught her coat, remained forever below. Tonight, she came to Adriano Salvati's mansion filled with confidence, carrying inside her the expectation that this evening would be a chance to strengthen important business connections, to affirm once again her position among the city's elite. And as she stepped into that magnificent gilded space, sweeping her eyes over everything with the gaze of someone always ready to find a flaw to judge, she could not possibly imagine that in only a few short hours, the iron certainty about rank and power she had held all her life would be shattered in this very room, before all the people whose respect she so desperately desired. The first hours of the gala passed in a polished and graceful atmosphere, the soft sound of piano music slipping through the low murmur of conversation, crystal glasses glittering beneath the lights, and the service staff moving among the clusters of guests with the invisible rhythm of people trained to be present without drawing attention. Among them was Teddy Brink, a 19-year-old young man who had not been working there long, his face still boyish, and his eyes still carrying the tense brightness of someone young who was trying with all his strength to do well at his first real job. He carried a silver tray filled with glasses of red wine, moving carefully through the crowd with intense concentration. And when he passed the place where Margaret Calloway stood among a group of powerful guests, something happened that later, those with sharp eyes standing nearby would silently understand had not been an accident at all. Margaret, at the exact moment he went by, lightly pushed out her elbow, a small, quick movement so slight that almost no one noticed in time, nudging the edge of the tray just enough to make one glass sway and then tip over, sending several dark drops of wine splashing onto the hem of her expensive evening gown. In an instant, Teddy's face went white with panic. He hurried to steady the tray before anything else could fall, and began stammering an apology. But before he could finish, Margaret turned sharply toward him, and her voice rose, not very loud, but so icy and full of authority that the conversations around her immediately died away. She scolded him for being clumsy, called him the kind of person who was not capable of handling even the simplest task, said that a venue calling itself high-end should be ashamed to hire people like him, that he had ruined a gown, likely worth more than he earned in an entire year, and she poured out those words with the calm cruelty of someone far too accustomed to venting anger on the powerless without ever having to face a consequence. Teddy stood rooted in place, his face flushing red and then turning pale again, his hands trembling around the tray, and the humiliation written so clearly across his young face made several nearby guests look away in discomfort, but not one of them spoke up, because stepping into the fury of someone like Margaret Calloway brought no benefit to anyone. It was at that moment, from the far end of the great hall, that Clara immediately sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way the sounds had suddenly dropped, the tense silence spreading outward like ripples across water, and with the instinct sharpened by years of working in spaces like this, she understood that something had gone off course. She set down what she was holding, then walked toward the crowd with her usual calm stride, neither hurried nor hesitant. And when she reached them, she gently placed herself between Margaret and the trembling young man, like a soft wall shielding him from the storm. She spoke to Margaret in a measured and respectful voice, offering an apology for the inconvenience the lady had suffered, assuring her that the gown would be attended to immediately, and that the rest of the evening would proceed perfectly. She said all of it without lowering her head in submission, without a trace of fear in her eyes, her calm so complete that it could almost have been mistaken for indifference, though in truth it was the composure of a person who knew exactly what she was doing, soothing the situation rather than kneeling before it. Margaret looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, her eyes slowly sweeping from Clara's composed face down to her simple apron, pausing at her straight posture, and the strange stillness radiating from this woman, and something in that stillness made Margaret feel vaguely irritated, like the annoyance of pushing against a door that refused to open the way she wanted it to. She said nothing more, but as Clara led the young man away, Margaret's eyes continued to follow her, and in that gaze lingered a cold contempt, the kind of contempt not aimed at one particular person, but at an entire class, the gaze of someone who had long ago finished judging what sort of person stood before her, and how much that person was worth. About 1 hour after the incident with the young server, when the gala had moved into the buffet portion, and the guests had begun scattering throughout the great hall with glasses of wine in their hands, Margaret Calloway went to the private reception area, where, according to the procedure Adriano Salvati had established long ago, guests could leave jewelry that was too valuable or too cumbersome to be safely worn throughout the evening. She lifted a hand to the back of her neck and removed the diamond necklace she had been wearing, a piece that anyone could tell with one glance was no ordinary adornment, with stones cut so exquisitely that they caught the light and glittered with every movement. And she said, in her usual condescending tone, that this was an heirloom of her family, worth more than the home of anyone standing there in service, and that she expected it to be watched with care. The person assigned to receive and handle those items according to the security procedure was none other than Clara, and she stepped forward, still carrying the calm manner that had become part of her very nature, accepting the necklace from Margaret's hand with measured gentleness, not gasping in admiration at its value as Margaret perhaps secretly expected, but simply treating it exactly as she treated every possession entrusted to her, with the care of someone who understood the weight of the responsibility she was carrying. Under Margaret's eyes, and those of several nearby guests, Clara opened the familiar leather-covered ledger, clearly and meticulously recorded the description of the piece, the time it was received, and then assigned a number to that entry, exactly according to the order she had never once broken. The contrast between the two women in that moment was so clear that anyone perceptive could feel it. One of them, Margaret, with her showy impatience, repeatedly reminding everyone of the item's value, as if wanting to make sure the maid in front of her fully understood what an important thing she had been handed. And the other, Clara, quiet and precise, not allowing the material worth of the necklace to alter even by a fraction the way she carried out her work. Because to her, an object worth a fortune and an ordinary silver tray both deserved the same degree of seriousness. After finishing the record, Clara carried the necklace into the small room hidden behind the study, the room to which only she had the key, and there, beneath the quiet light, she opened the wall safe with the code that existed in the memory of only 2 people, placed the jewelry into its own separate compartment, according to the number written in the ledger, then closed the steel door, turned the lock twice, and tested it once more as she always did. A motion that had become a ritual so deeply rooted in habit that she performed it almost without needing to think. Everything had gone exactly according to procedure, without one misstep. The necklace now lay safely inside the heart of the safe, fully recorded in the ledger, locked behind 2 turns of the lock and a door no one else in the mansion besides her could open. Clara locked the room door, slipped the key back onto the small chain she always wore close to her body beneath her clothing, then returned to the great hall to continue overseeing her duties, her heart entirely at peace as it always was, because she knew she had fulfilled her responsibility beyond reproach, that the item entrusted to her was in the safest place it could possibly be, and that if anyone asked about it, she needed only to open the ledger, open the safe, and everything would appear clearly and transparently as daylight. She could not possibly know that this very transparency, this perfect procedure she had just carried out with practiced ease, was about to be deliberately ignored by someone, trampled beneath an accusation, hurled not in pursuit of truth, but because of a malice that had already been waiting, and that the necklace resting safely inside the steel safe would soon become the excuse for a public humiliation in the middle of a crowded room. About half an hour later, when the party was at its liveliest, Margaret Calloway suddenly raised her voice in the middle of the great hall, and that voice carried a tone entirely different from her usual condescension, the tone of outrage carefully staged. She declared that her family heirloom diamond necklace had vanished, that she had just asked for it, and no one could return it to her, and that in a house crawling with servants, it was hardly difficult to understand how an item of such value could disappear into thin air. Those words immediately caused the surrounding conversations to fall silent. The guests began turning their heads to look, and Margaret, as if strengthened by the very attention she was drawing, swept her eyes around the crowd and then stopped on Clara, who had just stepped forward after hearing the commotion. She pointed straight at her and loudly accused this girl of being the last person to hold the necklace in her hands, of having carried it somewhere, and of being, Margaret was certain, the one who had stolen it. Clara stood still for a moment, not flustered by the sudden accusation, and then she spoke, her voice still calm and clear, explaining that the necklace had been received according to procedure, carefully recorded in the ledger, and safely placed in the safe, and that if Margaret wished, Clara could open the safe immediately to prove that the item was still intact inside. She offered this with the steady confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, and if Margaret had simply nodded, if she had agreed to follow Clara to the small room behind the study, the entire performance could have ended within a few short minutes, with the truth laid bare. But that was exactly what Margaret did not want. She had no intention of allowing the truth to be proven, because her anger had never truly been about the necklace, but about something deeper, a smoldering irritation that had begun from the moment the woman in the apron dared place herself between Margaret and the young server, dared face her with that unyielding stillness. So the moment Clara finished speaking and turned as if to lead her toward the safe, Margaret immediately cut her off with a dismissive wave of the hand, declaring that she had no need to go anywhere to inspect anything, that she did not believe a single word from the mouth of someone like Clara, and that this little act of opening the safe to prove her innocence was nothing more than a clumsy performance by a dishonest person trying to conceal her guilt. She raised her voice even higher, and this time her words no longer circled around the necklace, but shifted into something far crueler, more personal. She began to stab at Clara herself, at Clara's background, saying that she knew very well what dark places people like her came from, that those rough, calloused hands were the mark of a lowly life, that the blood of the destitute, no matter how many layers of decency they wrapped around themselves, could never wash clean the thieving nature inside. Every word she spoke was like a knife aimed directly at the place she believed to be this girl's weakest point, and she said them with the triumphant voice of someone certain she was standing on a high platform, from which she could freely cast any judgment she pleased down upon those below. The entire great hall had now sunk into a thick silence, every eye fixed on the two women, and while Margaret climbed higher and higher into her fury, growing louder and more vicious as though fed by the very crowd watching her, Clara remained standing there, her back straight, her head lifted, her gray eyes fixed directly on the woman, insulting her without blinking, without turning away, without retreating even half a step. She did not answer those insults. She did not try to argue or explain further, because she had realized something that perhaps the whole room was beginning to realize as well, that this woman was not searching for the truth, not searching for her necklace, but searching only for a victim upon whom she could pour the power and contempt she had grown used to dispensing, and that Clara's steady silence, instead of soothing Margaret's rage, was feeding that fire in a way that, in only a moment more, would flare into something that could not be taken back. Clara's stillness, that calm refusal to break apart, seemed to become something Margaret could no longer endure, because for a woman accustomed to seeing others tremble and shrink before her anger, facing someone who still stood straight and looked directly into her eyes without fear was an insult even greater than any argument. She stepped closer, her diamond-covered finger pointing straight at Clara's chest, and her voice rang out shrill and sharp in the breathless great hall, demanding that the girl lower her head and confess at once, that she admit before everyone that she was a thief, that she was not worthy to stand in a room like this. Clara still said nothing. She only looked at the woman pouring fury over her with an almost unsettling calm, a gaze that held neither challenge nor pleading, only the steady presence of a person who knew exactly who she was and refused to let another person's words define her differently. And it was that firm silence, that unshaken posture, that pushed Margaret past the final line of restraint. Her hand flew up. It was not a wide movement. It was short, sharp, and fast enough that the whole room only understood what had happened after it had already happened, and the sound rang out, a dry, clear crack echoing between the marble walls and crystal chandeliers, filling the space that had already grown thick with silence. Clara's head tilted slightly to one side for a brief moment, then slowly returned to where it had been. She did not lift a hand to her cheek. She did not make a sound. She did not step back even half a pace. She simply stood there, her gray eyes still fixed on Margaret with the same unwavering composure she had carried from the beginning. And in that stillness there was something the entire room could feel but could not name, an invisible weight that seemed to freeze the air itself. Margaret stood there, her hand still hanging loosely at her side after the blow, her breathing a little quicker, and a strange flicker crossed her face, not quite regret, but the first vague awareness that the silence in the room now had a very different quality from the silence only seconds before. Clara allowed the moment to settle. Then she spoke, and her voice was so soft that the guests at the nearest tables had to lean forward to hear it, a quiet voice so utterly controlled and without emotion that it created a chilling emptiness in the center of the room. She asked whether Margaret was certain she truly understood what she had just done. That question, spoken calmly and without any open threat, carried a force that made Margaret pause, and to hide the unease just beginning to stir inside her, she let out a short, contemptuous laugh, a sound aimed as much at the crowd as at Clara. Then she turned to a nearby server and ordered, in the voice of someone certain, her command must be obeyed immediately, that she wanted to see the manager at once, and that this person, this thief, must be thrown out of here immediately. But what happened next, or rather what did not happen, was what sent the first real chill down Margaret's spine. The server did not move. She glanced at Clara, then back at Margaret, and remained standing there with a strange, uncertain expression. Margaret glared at her and repeated the order once more, louder and sharper, but still, not one of the uniformed staff members in the great hall stepped forward to carry out what she demanded. All of them stood oddly still, exchanging looks Margaret could not read, and for the first time in an evening she had believed she fully controlled, Margaret Calloway began to feel, dimly and uneasily, that something here lay entirely beyond her understanding. That quiet yet stubborn refusal to obey began to gnaw at the sense of control Margaret had always taken for granted as her own, because in all her life, she had never once had to face the experience of issuing an order and watching it fall into empty space without anyone bothering to pick it up. She swept her eyes across the great hall, and this time, instead of seeing bowed faces of submission or frightened, evasive glances such as she was used to seeing whenever she grew angry, she encountered something entirely different, something that confused her even more than open defiance would have. The servants scattered around the room did not seem panicked. They simply stood there with a strange restraint, and in the way they glanced toward Clara and then back at one another, there was something like an unspoken understanding of which Margaret had no part, as if all of them knew some truth that she alone, in this entire room, was still too blind to recognize. Margaret shifted her gaze to the guests, hoping to find there the agreement she was certain she deserved, hoping someone would nod in approval or offer a word of support for what she had just done. But what she received was only silence, and it was a silence more frightening than criticism, because it was not empty, but heavy, not the muteness of accomplices, but the held breath of people waiting for something that was about to happen. The married couple who had been sitting near her table were now staring intently down into the wine glasses in their hands, deliberately avoiding eye contact with her. The older man she had thought of as an ally was turning his body slightly away, as if trying to separate himself from the space that was gradually becoming dangerous around Margaret. And here and there in the crowd, whispers began passing from one ear to another, too soft for her to hear clearly, yet still enough for her to feel that people were speaking about something she should have known, but did not know at all. A vague unease, a feeling Margaret had not tasted in so many years that she had almost forgotten it existed, began to creep into her. At first, only a small ripple at the bottom of her heart, then slowly widening into a suspicion that became harder and harder to deny, the suspicion that perhaps she had misjudged something very important. She tried to steady herself, smoothing the hem of her gown, lifting her chin in the way she always did to reassert her authority. But the gesture now carried a stiffness, like an actress trying to cling to her role even as the stage beneath her feet began to crack. And then her eyes suddenly stopped on a man from the security team standing near the main exit. A man who had just raised one finger to touch the small earpiece fitted at his ear, listening to something being transmitted to him. Margaret saw his face change, not in panic, but in a way that chilled her even more. The look of a man who had just realized that an incident he had thought was minor was not minor at all. The man straightened, his shoulders tightening, and he looked toward the passage leading out from the study deep inside the mansion, then began to move, not toward Clara as Margaret secretly hoped, but in another direction, as if clearing a path, as if preparing for the arrival of someone. Margaret followed his steps with a tightening feeling in her chest, and though she still could not understand what was happening, though she still tried to hold on to the belief that she was in command, she could not deny the cold instinct rising within her, that the balance of this room, the balance she had believed was tilted entirely in her favor, was silently shifting toward another side she could not control. Adriano Salvati was not the kind of man who made a noisy entrance. His presence simply arrived, the way pressure arrives before a storm, quiet at first, then sudden, carrying with it the quality of something that could not be reversed. He stepped out from the passage leading to the study deep inside the mansion, tall and unhurried, not rushing in the slightest, and within only a few heartbeats, the whole room had felt him. The whispers died away, heads turned slightly, and the crowd, like invisible iron filings, rearranged itself around the magnetic field he gave off. A few guests straightened by reflex, others dipped their heads in greeting, and even the most powerful people in the room, those accustomed to being respected by others, unconsciously adjusted their posture as he passed. Because in the world they all belonged to, everyone understood that this man stood on a different level. He said nothing as he entered. His cold, sharp eyes swept across the room with methodical precision, reading the temperature of the space in the way he always did, taking in the tense stillness at the center of the great hall, taking in the restrained worry on the faces of the staff, and then that gaze stopped on Clara. She was standing a few steps away from Margaret, her back still straight, her face still holding its familiar composure, but on her left cheek, beneath the crystal lights, there was an unmistakable red mark, a trace so clear it told its own story without needing a single word. Adriano stopped walking. Everyone standing around him seemed to freeze with him, and the room fell into a silence even deeper than before. Not the silence of a crowd waiting for someone to speak, but the held breath of people who understood that something serious had just happened and were waiting to see where it would lead. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He only looked once around the room and asked a single question, in the low, flat voice of a man asking something whose answer he already suspected, yet still asking because the question itself was part of judgment. He asked who had done this. No one answered at once. The silence stretched heavily. Several guests lowered their eyes to their hands, and then from the back, an older man with a calm bearing and sharp eyes stepped forward. It was Salvatore Ricci, Adriano's right hand for many years, the man who had witnessed the entire incident from a hidden corner of the room. Without embellishment, without commentary, without accusation, he briefly and precisely recounted what had happened, that the guest had loudly accused the housekeeper of stealing a piece of jewelry, that the housekeeper had offered to open the safe to prove otherwise, but the offer had been refused, and that after a series of insults, the guest had struck her across the face, in the middle of the great hall before everyone present. When that account ended, Adriano looked at Clara, and she met his gaze, giving a nod so slight it was almost imperceptible, confirming what had just been said without adding a single word. Margaret, who had been standing there all this time, with the feeling that the ground beneath her feet was becoming unstable, hurried to grasp what she believed was an opportunity to turn the situation around. because she had met Adriano several times at past events and had always assumed that some kind of equal relationship existed between them. She stepped forward, putting into her voice the reasonable tone of someone who believed she had done nothing wrong, and she began to explain, saying she was very sorry for this disturbance, but that he had to understand her circumstances. That after all, the person standing there was only a maid, and a thieving maid at that, so it was perfectly understandable if she had handled the matter a little forcefully. The moment those words left her mouth, the entire great hall seemed to sink another degree, and Adriano did not answer immediately. He simply let that sentence hang in the air, let it settle and seep into every person listening, the way a rest note holds an entire piece of music, not as an absence, but as a presence with its own weight. When Margaret's words had fully settled, when the contemptuous echo of the words "only a maid" still seemed to linger in the air, Adriano finally spoke slowly, and his voice was not loud, but every word he uttered was so clear and sharp that no one in the great hall could fail to hear it. He said that she had just made a mistake she did not even have enough understanding to recognize the size of. Then he turned fully toward the room and began telling all those powerful people standing there about the woman in the apron whom they had just watched be humiliated. He said that 5 years ago, this woman, at a time when she herself was in desperate need, had by chance come into possession of something that belonged to him. Something that, had she chosen to keep it or sell it, could have brought her enough money to change her entire life, or worse, could have been used to destroy him, to strike him with a fatal blow that very few of his enemies had ever been given the chance to deliver. He said she had not done that she had stood waiting in the cold to return to him what was his, intact and untouched, and when he asked her why, she had answered with only one simple sentence, because it was not hers. The whole room fell silent and listened, and Adriano went on. He said that throughout the 5 years since that day, this woman had been the only person in his entire world whom he trusted absolutely, the only person to whom he gave the keys to his most private rooms, the only person who knew things that, if they ever reached the outside, could bring an entire enterprise crashing down, and that in all that time, with all those opportunities, she had never once, not even once, betrayed that trust. Then he looked straight at Margaret, and in a cold voice that had hardened into steel, he said that the woman Margaret had just called a thieving maid had had more chances to betray him than anyone standing in this room, and she had never done so, while Margaret had betrayed a lifetime's worth of trust in the space of a single slap, simply because she could not endure the sight of a person she considered beneath her, daring to stand upright before her. Those words fell over the room like a sentence. And to end any remaining doubt, to make the truth he had just revealed impossible to deny, Adriano gave a small signal, and Clara, still with the same unchanged composure, quietly led a small group consisting of Adriano, Salvatore, Margaret herself, and several witnesses toward the little room hidden behind the study. Before everyone's eyes, she placed the familiar key from its usual hiding place and placed it into the lock, opened the door to the room no one but she could enter, then stepped to the wall, safe, entered the familiar code, and when the steel door opened, there it was, lying calmly in the exact separate compartment where she had placed it, recorded clearly under the correct number in the leather-covered ledger opened beside it. Margaret's family heirloom diamond necklace, glittering intact, without a single stone missing. The truth appeared before everyone's eyes, bare and undeniable. The necklace had never been stolen. It had been in the safest place it could possibly be all along, watched over by the very woman who had just been accused of stealing it, and the entire accusation Margaret had built, the entire public degradation she had poured over Clara's head, now stood revealed as a shameless lie, born not from truth, but from Margaret's own arrogance and malice. Margaret stood frozen, staring at her necklace lying safely inside the safe, and for the first time that evening, her face could no longer hold its triumphant confidence, because she understood that now, before all the people whose respect she had once longed to command, she no longer had even 1 inch of ground left to stand on. When the group returned to the great hall with the truth fully exposed, as whispers began spreading like ripples from one person to another, an older woman at a nearby table slowly rose to her feet. It was Mrs. Dolores Hartwell, a lady past 60, her silver hair neatly pinned up, her face carrying the composed look of someone who had lived through enough years not to be easily stirred by scandal. But now, on that face, there appeared an unusual emotion, a shock mingled with something that looked very much like late regret. She had sat quietly watching the entire incident from beginning to end, had heard every accusation, every insult Margaret had poured over Clara's head. And the more she listened, the more clearly a distant memory she had thought long asleep began to rise inside her, because the scene unfolding before her tonight, the way a powerful woman had built a theft accusation and then refused to listen to any explanation, the way she had moved from a missing object to attacking the victim's background, all of it was chillingly familiar, as if she were watching again a play she had once witnessed many years before. Dolores spoke, and though her voice was not loud, it was steady enough to make the whole room turn and listen. She said that many years ago, she had been present in a house where she had seen this very woman, this very Margaret Calloway, do exactly what she had done tonight, that at the time a diamond ring had supposedly disappeared. And instead of investigating the matter properly, Margaret had immediately aimed the accusation at a young maid, the poorest and newest person in the house, someone who had no one behind her to protect herself. She said the girl had stood in the room and insisted she was innocent, had asked to be searched in order to prove her honesty. But exactly as tonight, Margaret had not bothered to listen to a single word, had thrown the girl out of the house that very night, and withheld every bit of the wages she rightfully deserved, pushing an honest human being into hardship because of an accusation that had never been proven. And then, as she told that story, Mrs. Dolores's eyes slowly shifted toward Clara, looking carefully at the calm face and gray eyes before her, and the truth her mind had just pieced together seemed to catch in her throat, because she realized that the young maid who had been falsely accused all those years ago, the victim of that unjust performance she had witnessed and had regretted for years because she hadn't dared speak up, was no one else but the woman standing there now. It was Clara. That revelation shook the entire great hall, and every gaze immediately turned toward Margaret, who now stood rooted in place with a bloodless face, because the most terrible thing was not merely that her old wrongdoing had been exposed, but that she realized she had just repeated that same wrongdoing upon the very same person, a person she had not even recognized. All evening long, Margaret had stood facing Clara, had looked into her face, had insulted her with the cruelest words, and not once had there flashed in her memory the image of the girl she had once pushed into the street, because to Margaret, servants had never been individuals with distinct faces and separate fates worth remembering. They were only a type, a blurred and replaceable background, and it was precisely that contempt, sunk so deep she had never bothered to truly see a human being, that had blinded her and sent her rushing straight into the trap her own past had set. The circle of consequence had closed perfectly and cruelly in the middle of that gilded hall, and Clara, the only person who knew the truth of that old story better than anyone else in the room, simply looked at the woman who had once destroyed a part of her life, not with the satisfied gaze of someone watching an enemy fall, but with the deep stillness of a person who had traveled so far beyond that wound that now she saw before her only a woman collapsing under the weight of the very things she herself had sown. Adriano Salvati was not the kind of man who needed loud threats or crude acts to make a person face consequences, because the power he held operated in a far quieter way, far more discreetly, and for that very reason, it was many times more ruthless. He turned to speak with several guests, standing nearby in his usual low and composed voice, and in those few brief sentences, he mentioned a truth that everyone present in that room silently understood, but rarely said aloud, that Margaret Calloway's husband, a politician with many ambitions, had long depended on a series of important projects and permits that, without the backing of the network of relationships Adriano controlled, would never have been able to take shape. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to issue any threat. He simply stated, calmly, that from this moment on, every form of support, every door he had once been willing to open for the Calloway family, would be closed, that the agreements currently under discussion would be suspended indefinitely, and that he was not in the habit of continuing business with people willing to trample another person's dignity merely to satisfy their own ego. That statement was spoken so calmly it was almost gentle, carrying no visible emotion, simply the announcement of a decision made by a man accustomed to making decisions that changed the fate of others, and the effect it created in the room unfolded with a speed and finality that made people feel cold. The very people who only a few hours earlier had surrounded Margaret with warm smiles, the partners who had once eagerly discussed cooperation with her family, now began making small but deeply meaningful adjustments, a slight lean away, a gaze suddenly busy with the screen of a phone, a polite enough excuse to step away and speak with someone across the room. Two men who had come to the gala that evening intending to discuss a joint project with Margaret's side quietly moved toward Adriano, joining another conversation, and by that gesture, they silently declared which side they had chosen. News of what had just happened spread through the great hall with the unstoppable momentum only upper-class scandal can possess. And as it spread, scattered pieces about Margaret Calloway, stories of how she had treated those beneath her, the times she had humiliated servants, the anecdotes people had once whispered behind her back, suddenly found a context in which to speak together, and the image she had spent so many years carefully building began to crack apart in pieces before her eyes. Margaret stood there, in the middle of the room that had once been the stage for her pride, and silently watched the world she had believed she had conquered turn its back on her one person at a time, one look at a time, one departing step at a time. And in that moment, she understood a truth she had never had to face in all her life, that the social empire she had built had not been founded on real respect at all, but had only been temporarily raised on fear and advantage, and that once the most powerful man in the room withdrew his endorsement, all that remained of her was an empty shell. She had entered this room tonight with the iron belief that it was simply another stage on which she would shine, another arena where victory was already hers. But now she understood that she had miscalculated disastrously, that she had utterly failed to recognize where she was standing and whom she was facing, and that late understanding came down upon her with a weight she had never felt in an entire life, sheltered by money and power. When the evening had moved toward its end and the commotion had slowly settled into a heavy stillness, Margaret Calloway, with a walk that was entirely different from the way she had entered, no longer carrying her usual proud, imposing stride, but instead moving with a strained caution, as though the ground beneath her feet had become unsteady, slowly approached Clara, who was standing near the entrance to the service area, quietly overseeing the last remaining duties. She stopped in front of her, and in a voice far smaller than the shrill, commanding one she had used only hours before, she said that she owed Clara an apology, that what she had done was wrong, and that she hoped Clara could forgive her. Clara looked at her for a long while, neither cruel nor angry, only calm and clear in her honesty. And then she answered that she had heard the words Margaret had said, but that she had lived long enough and passed through enough rooms to understand the difference between a person who regrets what they have done and a person who only regrets the price they must pay for it, and that she could not yet be certain which side of that line Margaret was standing on. She said that what had happened tonight, not only the slap but everything before it, every word of contempt, every act of looking down on another human being because of the clothes they wore or the work they did, was not the kind of wound that could be mended by a hurried apology offered while everything was collapsing, and that she would give herself the time she needed to decide how to answer that apology. Not here, not tonight, not under the pressure of a room full of people. She said all of it gently, without a trace of hatred, looking straight into Margaret's eyes, and it was precisely that calm lack of resentment that made her words heavier than any scolding could have been. Margaret stood silent for a moment, then gave a small nod, turned, and walked toward the exit, passing through the same people who only hours earlier had been willing to talk with her, but now answered her only with the cold politeness of strangers. No one stopped her. No one reached out a hand. And then she disappeared behind the door, stepping into the night where the city went on turning without needing her anymore. After she had gone, Adriano stepped into the center of the great hall and did something that stunned everyone who truly knew him. He spoke up and asked that his housekeeper be invited before everyone, and when Clara stepped out from the service corridor, the whole room looked at her. Then one by one, and then all at once, the most powerful people in the city quietly rose to their feet, and applause rang out, beginning in one corner and spreading like a wave until it embraced the entire great hall. A sincere and rare tribute that, in that world, was the most precious kind of wealth anyone could offer. Clara received it all with a slight bow and a modest smile, making no attempt to step into the center of attention, nor to linger beneath the glow any longer than courtesy allowed. And then, with the same quiet manner in which she had appeared, she turned and went back toward the small room behind the hall, back to the work she had always valued more than any applause. In the silent room, when the sounds from the great hall had faded into only a faint echo through the walls, Clara paused for a moment, and in her mind appeared the image of her mother from long ago, hands roughened by water and soap, but a back that had never bent, and the words her mother had given her with her final breath, that she must never let anyone make her believe she was beneath them, because she wasn't. Clara understood that through all the years, through every false accusation, every contemptuous glance, every door slammed in her face, she had lived exactly as her mother had told her to live. She had not allowed the low ceiling. Other people tried to press down over her to become the true limit of her life, and the dignity her mother had left her, the only treasure not kept inside any safe, had always been there, intact, through everything. Because a human being's dignity has never been something granted by another person's recognition, nor something that can be taken away by anyone's contempt. It is not a title, a position, or a number in a bank account. It exists before a room fills with people, and remains after the room has emptied, and it belongs forever to the one who has chosen to live inside it fully. Clara's story reminds each of us of something simple yet profound, that a person's true worth is never found in the work they do, the clothing they wear, or the fortune they possess, but in the kindness, honesty, and dignity they patiently guard through the most ordinary days, and that the way we treat people who can bring us no benefit is the truest measure of who we are. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button for our channel, press like, and share this video so you can hear many more meaningful and moving stories every day. How do you feel about Clara's story and about the choice she made in the end? Please leave a few lines in the comments below to share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and meaning every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.